Mark Winters stared at the termination notice in his trembling hands, the words blurring as tears threatened to spill. His daughter's insulin prescription sat on the kitchen counter, a reminder of what he stood to lose. His boss Victoria Chen had just fired him for missing too many meetings, never once asking why he'd been late. If you've ever felt the world crashing down around you while trying to keep a brave face for someone who depends on you, this story might break your heart before it heals it. Stay with me until the end to discover how sometimes, the people who hurt us most become our greatest allies when it matters. If this story touches you, please consider liking and subscribing. Your support helps bring more stories like Mark's to light. The morning had started like any other in Mark's small two-bedroom apartment. The persistent beep of his alarm clock pulled him from a restless sleep at 5:30 a.m. He rubbed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of exhaustion that had become his constant companion since becoming a single father 3 years ago. His wife Sarah's battle with cancer had been brief but devastating, leaving him alone to raise their daughter Emma, now 8 years old. "Daddy?" Emma's small voice called from the doorway of his bedroom. She stood there in her favorite unicorn pajamas, her brown hair a tangled mess around her face. Despite the early hour, she was already clutching her glucose monitor. "Hey, sweetheart," Mark said, forcing cheerfulness into his voice. "Numbers not looking good?" Emma shook her head, her lower lip trembling slightly. "It's really low again." Mark was beside her in an instant, guiding her to the kitchen where he kept the orange juice. Type 1 diabetes had entered their lives just 6 months after Sarah's death, as if fate hadn't been cruel enough. He poured a glass of juice and watched as Emma drank it, his mind already calculating how this morning's low blood sugar would affect their schedule. "We might be running a little late today, Em," he said, glancing at the clock. "Think you can eat some breakfast while I shower?" Emma nodded bravely, though her eyes betrayed her fatigue. These nighttime lows were becoming more frequent, disrupting both their sleep patterns. Mark kissed the top of her head before hurrying to get ready, knowing that every minute counted if he was going to make it to his 8:30 a.m. meeting at Chen Innovations. Victoria Chen had made it abundantly clear that punctuality was non-negotiable. As the founder and CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the city, she ran a tight ship. Mark had been lucky to land the position as marketing director 8 months ago, a job that paid well enough to cover Emma's medical expenses and their modest lifestyle. But lately, his performance reviews had been less than stellar, with Victoria's disapproving gaze following him whenever he slipped into meetings late or had to leave early for Emma's doctor appointments. By 7:45 a.m., they were in the car, Emma's backpack filled with her diabetes supplies alongside her schoolbooks. Mark navigated through morning traffic with one eye on the clock, dropping Emma at school with just enough time to make it to work, if traffic cooperated. It didn't. An accident on the highway turned his 20-minute commute into a 45-minute crawl. By the time Mark rushed into the conference room, the quarterly marketing presentation was well underway, and Victoria's cold stare cut through him like a knife. "Nice of you to join us, Mr. Winters," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of professional disdain that made his stomach clench. "Perhaps you'd like to explain the third-quarter projections you were supposed to prepare?" Mark fumbled through his presentation, acutely aware of how unprepared he appeared. The truth was, he'd stayed up until 2 a.m. finalizing those projections after spending the evening at the emergency room when Emma's blood sugar had spiked dangerously high. But excuses weren't welcome in Victoria's world of excellence and commitment. After the meeting, Victoria's assistant delivered the inevitable summons to her office. Mark walked the long corridor feeling like a man approaching the gallows. Victoria's office was minimalist and imposing, much like the woman herself. At 42, she had built her company from the ground up, earning a reputation for brilliance matched only by her uncompromising standards. Her dark hair was pulled back in a sleek bun, and her tailored suit spoke of the success she'd fought for. "Close the door, Mark," she said without looking up from her computer. When she finally raised her eyes to meet his, there was no warmth there. "This isn't working out." "Victoria, I can explain." "I've heard explanations before," she cut him off. 3 months of explanations, to be exact. Late arrivals, early departures, missed deadlines. Whatever personal issues you're dealing with, they're affecting your work, and I can't allow that to continue. Mark felt a surge of anger rise within him. Personal issues? My daughter has type 1 diabetes. She nearly went into ketoacidosis last night, which is why I was at the hospital instead of polishing my presentation. Something flickered across Victoria's face, surprise, perhaps, or a moment of doubt, but it was quickly replaced by her professional mask. I'm sorry to hear that, but this is a business, not a charity. We need people who can deliver consistently. I have delivered, Mark insisted, his voice rising slightly. Every campaign I've launched has exceeded targets. The Miller account alone brought in. The Miller account is precisely why I've been patient for this long, Victoria interrupted. But your recent work hasn't met our standards. I need someone I can rely on, Mark. Someone who puts this company first during business hours. The unfairness of it all hit Mark like a physical blow. So I'm supposed to put your company before my daughter's life? Victoria's expression hardened. That's not what I said. But there are plenty of people with family responsibilities who manage to fulfill their professional obligations. I'm not asking for anything unreasonable. Mark wanted to argue further, to make her understand the impossible balancing act he performed every day, but the resignation letter she slid across the desk told him her decision was final. Later that night, after Emma was asleep, Mark sat at his laptop, updating his resume and scanning job listings. The prospects were grim. Most positions offered lower salaries or required relocation, neither of which was viable with Emma's medical needs and their support system here. A notification from his email interrupted his search. It was from Dr. Patel, Emma's endocrinologist, confirming their appointment for the clinical trial they discussed. The experimental treatment could potentially improve Emma's glucose control significantly, reducing the dangerous highs and lows that disrupted their lives. But without insurance, the associated costs would be prohibitive. Mark closed his laptop and buried his face in his hands. For the first time since Sarah's death, he allowed himself to break down completely, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He had promised his wife he would take care of their daughter, that he would give her a good life. Now he felt like he was failing on all fronts. The next morning, Mark dropped Emma at school and headed to the office for what would be one of his final days. The marketing department was buzzing with speculation about his replacement, and the sympathetic glances from colleagues who'd heard about his termination only made things worse. He was clearing out his desk when his phone rang, Emma's school. His heart raced as he answered. Mr. Winters? This is Nurse Garcia. Emma's having a severe hypoglycemic episode. We've given her glucose, but she's not responding as quickly as we'd like. We think you should come. Mark was halfway out the door before he even ended the call, not bothering to explain his departure to anyone. In the elevator, he ran into Victoria, who raised an eyebrow at his obvious haste. Emergency, he said curtly, not caring anymore what she thought. To his surprise, Victoria held the elevator door open. What kind of emergency? My daughter, Mark replied, checking his watch anxiously. She's having a diabetes crisis at school. Victoria hesitated for a moment, then stepped into the elevator with him. I'll drive you. You're in no state to be behind the wheel. Mark was too shocked to protest. Within minutes, they were in Victoria's sleek BMW, speeding toward Emma's elementary school. The silence between them was tense until Victoria spoke. You never mentioned your daughter has diabetes. Mark gripped the door handle as she took a corner too quickly. Would it have made a difference? Victoria didn't answer immediately. How old is she? 8, Mark said, his voice softening despite himself. She was diagnosed right after her mother died. He saw Victoria's knuckles whiten on the steering wheel. I didn't know you were a widower. There's a lot you don't know about me, Mark replied. You never asked. They arrived at the school in record time. Mark rushed to the nurse's office with Victoria following behind, her presence incongruous in the elementary school hallway with her designer suit and authoritative stride. Emma was lying on a cot, pale and disoriented, the school nurse hovering nearby with a glucometer. When she saw Mark, Emma reached out weakly. "Daddy," she whispered, and the fear in her voice broke his heart. Mark was at her side instantly, checking her glucose readings and pulling out the emergency glucagon kit he always carried. "It's okay, Em. I'm here now." As he administered the injection with practiced hands, he was vaguely aware of Victoria standing in the doorway, watching the scene unfold with an unreadable expression. The glucagon worked quickly, bringing Emma's blood sugar up to safer levels. Color returned to her cheeks, and her eyes became more focused. When she noticed Victoria, curiosity overcame her fatigue. "Are you Daddy's boss?" she asked directly. Victoria seemed startled by the question. "Yes, I am." Emma's gaze was surprisingly stern for an 8-year-old. "You make him sad." Mark intervened quickly. "Emma, that's not appropriate." "But it's true," Emma insisted. "You work really hard, Daddy, but she still wants to fire you because you have to take care of me." The nurse, sensing the tension, discreetly stepped out, leaving the three of them alone in the small office. Victoria moved closer, her usual confidence seemingly diminished. "Is that what you think, Emma?" Emma nodded, her small hand clutching Mark's. "My daddy is the best daddy in the world. He checks my blood sugar in the middle of the night and makes special lunches that won't make me sick and still does all his work. But it's never enough for you." Mark was mortified, but also touched by his daughter's fierce defense. "Emma, Ms. Chen is just doing her job. The company has rules." "Rules are stupid if they hurt people," Emma declared with the simple clarity of childhood. To Mark's astonishment, Victoria knelt down to Emma's level, her expensive suit touching the linoleum floor without hesitation. "You're right, Emma," she said quietly. "Sometimes rules can be stupid if they don't take people into account." Emma studied Victoria's face with the frank assessment only children can get away with. "Do you have kids?" A shadow passed over Victoria's features. "No, I don't." "That's why you don't understand," Emma said, not unkindly. "It's hard to understand something if you haven't lived it." Victoria was silent for a long moment, her eyes moving from Emma to Mark and back again. Finally, she stood up, smoothing her skirt with a gesture that seemed more nervous than practical. "Mr. Winters, I think we need to revisit our earlier conversation," she said formally. "But first, let's get Emma home where she can rest." The drive to Mark's apartment was quiet, with Emma dozing in the back seat, exhausted from her glycemic episode. Mark kept glancing back at her, reassuring himself that she was okay. When they arrived, Victoria insisted on coming up, waving away Mark's protests. She stood awkwardly in their modest living room while Mark settled Emma in her bedroom with a stable glucose reading and a promise to check on her soon. When he returned to the living room, Victoria was examining the family photos on the wall, Mark and Sarah on their wedding day, Emma as a newborn, the three of them at the beach in happier times. "She looks like you," Victoria observed, indicating a picture of Emma. "She has her mother's smile," Mark replied, the familiar ache of loss momentarily overshadowing his current problems. Victoria turned to face him, her professional demeanor softened by something he couldn't quite identify. "I owe you an apology, Mark." He blinked, certain he had misheard. "I'm sorry." "An apology," she repeated, looking uncomfortable. "I made assumptions about your situation without having all the facts. That was unprofessional of me." Mark sank onto the couch, suddenly exhausted. "It doesn't change anything, though, does it? I still can't promise I'll never be late or have to leave suddenly. Emma's condition is unpredictable." Victoria sat down across from him, perching on the edge of an armchair as if afraid to fully commit to being in his space. "Tell me about it." About her diabetes. The request was so unexpected that Mark found himself explaining everything: the diagnosis shortly after Sarah's death, the learning curve of insulin management, the constant vigilance required to keep Emma's blood sugar in range, the sleep deprivation from nighttime checks, the emergency room visits when things went wrong despite their best efforts. Victoria listened without interruption, her expression growing more troubled with each detail. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "I had no idea," she finally said. "Why didn't you tell me any of this?" Mark gave a bitter laugh. "When would I have done that? During my interview, when I was trying to convince you I was the best candidate? During meetings, in front of the entire team? You're not exactly approachable, Victoria." She flinched slightly at his bluntness. "Fair point. But there are accommodations we could have made: flexible hours, remote work options for days with medical appointments." "Those options were never presented to me," Mark pointed out. "The company culture you've created doesn't exactly encourage asking for special treatment." Victoria looked genuinely troubled by this observation. "Is that how it comes across? As an environment where people can't ask for what they need?" "With all due respect, yes," Mark said, too tired to be diplomatic. "You've built a company that values results above all else. That's why you're successful. But it doesn't leave much room for human frailty." Victoria stood abruptly and walked to the window, her back to him. For a moment, Mark thought he'd gone too far, that she was angry. But when she turned around, there was something vulnerable in her expression that he'd never seen before. "My father was a factory worker," she said unexpectedly. "He never missed a day of work in 30 years, even when he was sick, even when my mother needed him. He believed that was what a responsible person did. I suppose I inherited that mindset." Mark wasn't sure how to respond to this sudden personal revelation. Victoria continued, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "But he died of a heart attack at his machine when I was 22. All those days he dragged himself to work instead of taking care of himself. In the end, what did it prove?" She met Mark's eyes directly. "I don't want to be the kind of boss who forces people to choose between their families and their jobs. I thought I wasn't, but clearly, I've been blind to the reality of your situation." Mark felt a glimmer of hope, quickly tempered by practicality. "What are you saying, exactly?" "I'm saying I want to rescind your termination," Victoria stated firmly. "And beyond that, I want to work with you to create a schedule that accommodates Emma's needs while still allowing you to contribute your considerable talents."